Thank you very much for being here. This is the second in our continual series now of a new event that we have instituted, the third Thursday Lunch and Learn series. So please feel free to eat if you want to. But more importantly, we wanted to continue having adult education. We did not want to wait until COVID is over with. And as far as this is the best opportunity for us to be together. And so our hope is that by summer, we'll be able to be together in person. But until then, we're going to continue doing these by Zoom. And the nice part too is that by being on Zoom and being able to record it, we're also going to share it with the community after this within the bi-weekly newsletter that comes from the Jewish Federation. So again, for those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Scott Litke. I'm the director of the Institute for Holocaust Education. And Kael and Ivy, our other staff members, both our administrative assistant and education coordinator, are very excited about what we're putting together with these different educational opportunities. And last time with about humor and in the Holocaust, today's presentation is a book talk from Kael Sagheer, our education director, and I'll let her explain more about it. But it's a very, very interesting program. We got into a very interesting philosophical conversation as a staff yesterday about this, so I know there'll be a lot to discuss. I've talked already too long, so I'm going to put myself on mute and turn this over to Kael.
All right, thank you all for coming. This is exciting, and I'm so excited because there are people here I haven't seen in ages since we went into lockdown 9 months ago. So welcome. For those of you who are returning from last month, thank you. I'm going to share my screen, first of all, quickly here, and then we're going to come back to group. There we go. Now, for those of you, who have been on Zoom for the last 9 months, bear with me. For those of you who haven't, you can organize the way you see the people over on your left. You can hide them completely. You can just see me if you want to, or you can open it up so that you can see more people. But we are going to come back to the gallery view and to each other in just a minute. I just wanted to introduce the book. We have 2 copies of this book here at the Federation. I have one in my office, and Shirley Banner has one from the library if you're interested in borrowing a copy after this. I first did this presentation for Metropolitan Community College in September and facilitated this book talk. We did it in an hour, and it was fast and it was a lot. So I'm grateful to have 90 minutes. I'm not sure if we'll use all the time, but I'm glad that we have that time. Just a little agenda so you know what's happening today. With the PowerPoint presentation, I'm going to give you a little history of this concentration camp. And then I'm going to give you a brief timeline of Johanna Langefeld. For those of you who read the summary, this will be a review. For those of you who didn't have a chance to read it, this will give you some information so that we can move to our discussion that we're going to have both in small group and in large group. And then we're going to wrap it up. So let us begin with a little bit of history of Ravensbrück concentration camp. These were some of the things that I listed down the left that I thought it was important to remind people, especially those that I presented to before, who may not have really understood the concept of a concentration camp. That these functioned outside the normal judicial system, and none of the prisoners who were in any of these camps were ever convicted of a crime. Charged, perhaps, but never convicted. And I think many people that I've come in contact with think of them as places where the Nazis sent the Jews, which is true. But the Nazis sent a lot of people to concentration camps. Anyone that they felt was a threat to their nation or to their culture was very likely to end up into one of these camps. And of course, they intentionally made harsh conditions because they were to be a deterrent to that behavior that was a threat to the nation. Many times it's interested people ask me, because I just entered my 3rd year as the education coordinator for IHE, what is the most like surprising or shocking thing that you have learned? And while I've learned many shocking things, one of the most surprising things that I have learned is how many concentration camps there actually were. The current data says more than 44,000. Some studies now are saying up to 60,000 concentration camps in Nazi-occupied Europe. And of course, this map that I'm showing you is not all of Nazi-occupied Europe even. I mean, because I've seen a map where they've tried to put all the dots and you can't see the map. So in this count is everything you see listed down the right: ghettos and concentration camps, forced labor camps and transit camps, POW camps, extermination camps, anywhere where people were held against their will for the purpose of, for the Nazi purposes. And this is something that really shocked me. I want to go back just a minute, because Ravensbrück and is up in what became East Germany after the war and after the Iron Curtain fell. And that is significant because we didn't know much about it for a really long time, because it was kind of walled off from the Western world. But Ravensbrück was built in 1939, and it was the first concentration camp made exclusively for women. Most of the initial inmates came from a prison called Lichtenberg, which we'll talk more about in just a minute. Over the 6 years it was in operation, it held approximately 140,000 women from 30 plus countries. Now, I have not been able to track down all 30 countries, because to me that is a staggering number. But I do know for sure that every country that Nazi Germany occupied had inmates there, including the United States, Great Britain, of course, France, of course, Poland. And I think most of us have heard, most people know about the gassing and murder of millions of Jews during the Holocaust in concentration camps. But the story of Ravensbrück, however, it tells the story of the evolution of the atrocities that culminated with the final solution. It is a fascinating 658-page book. Once again, if you would like to borrow it for your long winter read, I would love to get you a copy. It's also on audiobook, if that is something that appeals to you. But we know more about a lot of the women now because of the recent research that has come out that culminated in Sarah Helm's book. So I'm gonna just tell you a little bit, like, who were these women who were here? There were so many classifications of prisoners in these concentration camps that the Nazis devised a system to tell who was who. And the system came with a key, essentially, posters that designated who was who. So in English, this is what you're seeing. There were political prisoners, there were professional criminals, lots of Jehovah's Witnesses, because they did not bend the knee to anyone but God. And so that was a threat to the Nazi regime. Homosexuals were considered asocial, and the antisocials, homeless, prostitutes, and then the Roma Sinti people as well. So they were all given these badges to tell who was who. And then, of course, the Jews had the yellow stars, but sometimes you can see across the bottom that they had, that they were both, that they had these intersecting offenses. And Olga Benario, for example, was a Russian-German communist. So she got the great honor, I say with great sarcasm, of having something that was both red and yellow to designate both of her crimes and why she was there. So this book, Robbinsbrook, has many, many stories inside of it. And so some of the people that were there was like Eugenia Clem, who was a Soviet POW. Her story is told within this story. And Kryzia Syz, who was a Polish rabbit. The rabbits in this concentration camp were the women on whom the medical experiments were done, especially the leg experiments that they did to try to see how they could better serve the men at the front line that would get shrapnel and wounds in their legs. So they did all these experiments at Ravensbrück. Kryzia was one of those rabbits. Olga Benario, which I mentioned before, and Greta Buber-Newman, she was a German communist, not Jewish, but a German communist. Elsa Krug's story is told in here. She's a prostitute from Dusseldorf. There was a Polish countess who was a historian and also a resistance fighter. She was here. And then there's some well-known names that were here. Corrie ten Boom was in Ravensbrück. Elizabeth Rothschild, who was the only Rothschild to die in the Holocaust. Gemma LaGuardia Gluck, which was the sister of the New York mayor. And Genevieve de Gaulle was sister of Charles de Gaulle. So many stories of inmates are within these 658 pages, but there was also the personnel. Dr. Sontag, he did medical experiments, but it was Dr. Karl Gebhardt who did the infamous leg wound experiments. Dr. Meneke, he was a psychiatrist who was brought in to evaluate these women for the very first euthanasia program. There was an interesting doctor, Dr. Treta, who was a Salvationist, a Salvation Army adherent, and actually practiced real medicine and considerable amounts of humanity when he came here. Dorothea Binns is a famous guard. She was quite beautiful and equally as cruel. And a female doctor, Dr. Hertha Oberhauser, who was a very ambitious woman dermatologist, and in Nazi Germany, women's role was mostly relegated to the home. So trying to become a female doctor, she saw this as her opportunity to what she thought was going to be practice real medicine. But then there were also the guards, and I hesitate to ever read off a slide, but this is a little hard to see, so I am gonna just read this for you. During the first week, almost half of the new recruits would come weeping to Frau Langenfeld and ask to be allowed to go home. She would explain to them that only the camp commandant could release them once they were enrolled, and that they must therefore go to him. Very few had sufficient courage to do so. So the majority of them stayed on, and many of them changed out of all recognition once they got into uniform. Top boots and a forage cap stuck at an angle on their heads gave them a feeling of confidence and superiority. From the beginning, they were taught to stifle any sympathy with the prisoners, who were always presented as morally degenerate and worthless. Again and again, one could observe the same transformation. Now this comes from Greta Buber-Newman, who I commented before was a German communist, and she becomes a really important person in the whole 658 pages. When I decided to do this book facilitation, that's a difficult thing to facilitate, all 658 pages, and so I struggled with how to proceed. And there are so many stories within this story. And so I took a risk, and what I decided was to focus on the head female guard, Johanna Langefeld. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about her life now, if those of you who didn't have time to read the summary. These next few slides are going to be pretty text heavy. And I made the decision not to include pictures because we have one fuzzy picture. of Johanna. And so instead, I wanted to just tell you her story. And so if it is difficult for you to see words and listen at the same time, please feel free to just close your eyes and let me tell you for the next 10 minutes the story of Johanna Langefeld and how she became the head female guard at Ravensbrück. She was born in 1900 in the Rohr Valley, a mining town. She was raised by a strict Lutheran father, and he was a blacksmith. So she knew from an early age that German women, their life is to get married and have children and provide the home that her mother did. But she always wanted more. Even as a young child, she wanted more. When she was young, she was filled with stories of the French occupation. And this is the French occupation that happened with Napoleon and his descendants. And so there was, even then, this kind of nationalistic, well, we're Germans, we're not French. And then when she was 14, she watched the men march off to war. And after World War I, there was a second French occupation. So her household was very nationalistic, very pro-German, and very staunch Lutheran. When she was 24, she got married to a miner. This was the first time she had moved away from her childhood home and married Wilhelm, who died 2 years later. And then she engaged in an affair and was left with a son after that and moved again to a bigger town in the Ruhr Valley. And then the 1929 Wall Street crash was really felt around the world. And this is on top of an already depressed German economy that is coming out of World War I. So here she is, single, alone with a son, and a really horrible economy, moving over and over, trying to find something. And this is what we don't know. Why did she move? Did she feel that she had to move? Was she looking for better opportunity? Or was she moving away from something? And those are empty blocks of information that we don't know. But we do know that her deepest fear was that her son Herbert would be taken away from her. So we know from Sarah Helm that it was her religious conviction that drew her to work with the poorest of the poor. She turned to God and chose to help the destitute. And so she started to work and teach home economics, which moved her to a job into a workhouse for asocials. So that word in and of itself is interesting, asocial. Homeless women, poor women who were there to work and supposedly be re-educated. She was dismissed in 1937, and the details are fuzzy. Some documents say poor performance, some documents say theft, but it was this year that she joined the Nazi Party. It was also this year that Himmler started to put together the network of camps. So she was hired by Himmler himself and started to work at Lichtenberg Fortress, which was a castle that had been turned into a prison just for women. And she quickly advanced to be the senior guard there. So when Ravensbrück opened in 1939, she was an obvious choice to move over and start that camp. Now, they didn't call it a concentration camp, they called it a re-education camp. This is where these women were going to come and be re-educated in theory to become better, more productive contributors to the German state. Johanna Langefeld was anti-Semitic, and this shouldn't be surprising. This was something that had been in Europe for a long time if you weren't Jewish. So I put a couple quotes here. She hated the Jews as much as anyone, but she felt like she was helping protect the homeland. Sarah Helm actually uses this vocabulary in her book when she's describing Johanna's upbringing, that in the family, they talked a lot about making Germany great again and coming out of these occupations of the French and reinstigating and reclaiming their own German culture, language, and traditions. So over the next 3 years, as she was the chief female guard, the struggles really began because she thought she would have complete control over what happened in this re-education camp. And that was, of course, the farthest thing from the truth. So there are many struggles with her male superiors. And then consequently, because her male superiors were so brutal, the conflict started within herself. If you read the summary, there's a part in there about her, Lieutenant Kugel is his name, and he wants to institute corporal punishment. And she thinks this is absolutely unacceptable for women. You know, they can stand in the cold and they can be well disciplined and they can work long hours, but they should not be flogged. They should not be beaten. They should not experience corporal punishment. Well, as we all know, she was overruled completely. But that started to really conflict with her sense of what was right and wrong. Another struggle that started to develop within herself developed after she developed friendships. And I'm going to say, no, not friendships, relationships with some of the people in the camp. Two in particular, Greta Buber-Newman, who became her right-hand woman in the camp, and the countess, the Polish countess, who became her interpreter. Because after the war began, there was a huge influx of Polish women who were thought to be threats, of course, into the camp. And they, at any given time, were the majority, these Polish resistors. And it didn't take much to be picked up or suspected of resistance and sent to this camp. Sarah Helm says over and over, according to Greta Buber-Newman, Johanna never lost her faith and was always struggling with what was right and what was wrong. She even developed some compassion and tried to instigate some things to help raise spirits in the camp. Of course, most of these things had to be done on the sly. But after 1942, she was promoted, if you will, to Auschwitz to establish the new women's camp at Auschwitz. And she was very excited about this because she really thought that if she was in charge, she could do better than what was happening at Ravensbrück. She fervently believed in the ideals of National Socialism and making Germany great again. And she thought this was going to be her chance to really do what she wanted to do and to do it well. But obviously that is not at all what happened. And this was definitely the climax of her wartime story, where things took a rather dire turn for everyone. She realized not long after she got there, she was witness to what Sarah Helm thinks was the first gassing at Auschwitz. And this shook her a great deal because although the euthanasia program had started and she was being asked to give lists of people at Robbinsbrook, these people would get in a truck and drive away. And so she was able to block that out, or at least hide the reality of what was happening from herself. Willful denial is what I call that. But now she was at Auschwitz. She saw it with her own eyes. She could no longer deny what was happening. And it started to break her. So of course she did what she thought was right, and she made a protest. And but the gravity of it all started to really affect how she thought and how she acted. Soon after that, there was a massacre, a pretty awful massacre in the women's camp. And her male superiors said this is not this. Before that, actually, she asked to be sent back to Ravensbrück. She said, no, I can't, send me back. I'll go back to Ravensbrück and do what I was doing. And they said, no, nope, we brought you here for a reason. Do what we ask you to do. Then the massacre occurred and many, many women were killed. And they said, her supervisors or superiors saw this as a breakdown of order. And so she also broke her ankle. So she had to have some surgery, and under the auspice of this surgery, that she could no longer do her job, she was finally then in October demoted or sent back to Ravensbrück. By the time she got back there, the woman they had left in charge there, affectionately known as the Beast, was actually sent to replace her in Auschwitz. She went back, and things had already really fallen apart there, and not only fallen apart in the camp, but started to fall apart in her mind. One of the most interesting things is that she still seemed to really admire Hitler, and she had convinced herself that Hitler did not know what these awful, violent SS men were doing. And she had convinced herself that that was the truth, and that if Hitler knew what was really happening, he would be appalled and would put a stop to this. So after she went back, many things happened. I had mentioned the rabbits before, who were subjected to these awful experiments, but they were told that if they allowed these experiments to happen, that would secure their release, when in reality there was no intention of releasing them. And Johanna realized what was happening is, one by one, they were disappearing, and some of them were being shot. And this completely went against any sense of justice that she had left, that these Polish young women were lied to. And we'll talk about that later, that this is the thing that really, really upset her. And so during this last year at Ravensbrück, Greta Buber-Newman, who was her assistant, and this quote is from her, she looked paralyzed and in pain. She was having bad dreams. She was talking to herself. She was really struggling. And at one point, Greta Buber-Newman said to her, then why do you keep, why are you doing this? And Johanna said, because if I'm here, I can prevent the worst from happening. But at this point, she realized that maybe she couldn't. And so there was a point at which her superiors asked for all the rest of the rabbits to present themselves. And she knew exactly what was going to happen and told them to all go back to their barrack, and essentially saved their lives. But she was fired, and she was arrested, and for breach of discipline and excessive sympathy is what was written down. Eventually, she was released without trial, and she went to spend the rest of the war working at a BMW plant in Munich. But just when she thought the worst was behind her, she was then arrested by the Allies and extradited to Poland for the Auschwitz trials. While she was there, she escaped from jail. And the pieces that they've put together is that she was helped to escape by some of these Polish rabbits and some of these Polish prisoners whose life she helped to spare. So for the next 10 years, she is hidden in Poland, in convents, in Catholic churches, and by these women, until she decides, I think in 1957, that she really wants to see her son again. So they sneak her through the Iron Curtain, and she goes back and is able to see her son, and she goes to Greta Buber-Newman's house and kind of spills the story and asks for forgiveness. And then says something very curious. She said, I think I need to be in jail, at least for 2 years. But she lives until the 1970s, until she is about 73 years old. So that is a little bit about Johanna Langefeld, where she came from, how she got there, how she thought she was doing good, how she wanted to do good, how she thought she could prevent the worst from happening, how she couldn't prevent the worst from happening. A very complex character. And so now we're going to move into our discussion part of the program. And these are some of the discussion questions, and you'll see these again. I just want to talk about her. Now, this is difficult when you haven't read the book, and maybe not even the synopsis. But in just a minute, we're going to move into breakout rooms. So for just a second, I'm going to stop sharing this and bring us back into gallery mode, because some of us have done breakout rooms and some of us not. So the first thing I want everybody to look for at the bottom of their screen is a little speech bubble that says chat. Because in that chat, I am going to put those 4 questions. So because once you go into your breakout room, you won't be able to see the yellow slide, but they will all be right there. And so I'm going to break us into 4 breakout rooms. So for those of you who have never been in a breakout room, it's really easy. In just a minute, you're going to see a little invitation that's inviting you to either room 1, 2, 3, or 4. And all you have to do is press the button that says accept. That's all you have to do. And when we're done in our discussion rooms, you will automatically come back to this gallery. You don't have to do anything else other than click that one button. But what I would like you to do is pay attention to what room you are being invited to, because those of you in room 1 are going to talk about question 1. Where do you see goodness and virtue in Johanna? Where do you see meanness and vice in Johanna? And how do you account for this? If you're invited to room 2, you're just going to talk about question 2, which is how were Johanna and the prisoners different from each other, and how were they the same? And if you're in room 3, you're going to talk about how is it possible to hate one group of people like the Jews, but show compassion to another group of people like the Poles? And do you know anyone like this? And if you're invited to room 4, you're going to contemplate and discuss, if you were Johanna, what, if anything, would you have done differently and why? And then when we come back together, we're going to report out. So it will be good for you in your room to maybe designate or voluntel, have somebody who's going to speak for your group when you come back out, and we'll hear what everybody discussed. Now, 5 minutes seems never enough for me in breakout rooms, and 10 minutes almost seems too long, so I'm giving you 7. We're going right down the middle. But when the time is up, you'll see a little countdown clock that says you have 60 seconds left, and then you will automatically come back into the gallery. So I am going to send you to a breakout room. Remember to look at the number of your room so you know which question, and these questions will still remain in the chat if you forget what they are. And I will see you in 7 minutes. Actually, you know what? I need to do this again because I opened the rooms before everybody was on. So I'm going to recreate. My apologies. There we go. Now everybody should have a room. Did you get it, Paula? Can't?
You have a few that don't look like they're assigned.
Why are you not assigned? Where are you, Paula? I'm looking for you.
So I think we have question 4, is that right?
I am. For some reason, I can't send you into room 3. So I'm just going to move you to room 4. And you should have another invitation. Do you see it?
You also have Steve Weiss.
Yep, I'm seeing. I'm gonna move Sandy to room 3. And hopefully Sandy will see that invitation, that button to click. And if she is on her phone, that might be why she might need to swipe left or swipe right.
Steve Weiss too.
Yeah.
There. Okay, Sandy's gone. Now we just have Steve.
All right, and I'm gonna move. And then hopefully, Steve, you'll see an invitation to join room 2. And who? Steve, are you seeing anything? He may have stepped away. That might be why. Now you're muted, Scott.
Yeah, thank you. Should I turn the recording off until we come back? Or because I think it'll just keep recording you and I right now.
Oh, yeah, I don't know though. Yeah, I have no idea how that works.
We are back recording, Kael.
Okie doke, thanks. Welcome back, everyone. How is 7 minutes? Long enough, too long? Gloria's giving me that. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know, Bobble. All right, welcome back, everyone. So I think you all come back into the gallery muted, so feel free to unmute yourselves, especially whoever got voluntold that they get to be the spokesperson for room 1. So room 1, you guys were discussing where you saw virtue in Johanna and where you saw vice and how you accounted for this. And that was a really loaded question. Who is speaking for room 1? If you're like me, you've probably forgot to like designate somebody. And now you're all looking at each other going, oh shoot. So now this is where we need a brave volunteer.
Well, you're right, Kael. We didn't decide. and you're right that the time constraint is very difficult. We kind of got hung up a little bit on other things, which was still good. But the first, and I have to look and see if I can find the exact question. Okay, so we talked about the goodness and the virtue and decided that she certainly had compassion and that she wanted to make things better if she could. We did not really address the meanness or the vice portion of that. And it was pointed out that, how do we account for her behavior, her attitudes, and that much of it came from her family life, how she was brought up, the lessons that she learned there. So I'm going to stop now, and if anybody else that was in the group wants to chime in and clarify or expound on anything I said, that's great.
The gallery is open.
Please take yourselves off mute.
No, I agree. I agree with Donna, what you said, that she showed compassion. A lot of people that you read about in concentration camps who were commanders or in charge had no compassion whatsoever. So she did have that side of it, she showed that side that she wanted to help them. She wanted to save some. So There was complete conflict within her, I'm sure.
Thank you. Anyone else from group one?
I don't see much good in her. I'm sorry. And maybe I'm bitter because my mother died in one of those camps. But I think if she really wanted to do some good, she should have tried harder. I don't know what she could have accomplished, but
I'm so glad you made it today, Agnes, and I was so hoping you would say that because this is a really complicated.
well, that's what happened in the chat room. We got caught up on my story and on my hiding, and that's how we got away from the subject.
That is a very worthy way to spend 7 minutes, and you probably could have had like 77 minutes. So sorry, group one.
It was all good. It was all good.
It was.
Well, if you need more information on Agnes's story, you know who to come to. Well, let's move on to question 2 and breakout room 2, where you were discussing how were Johanna and the prisoners different from each other and how were they the same? How about it, group 2? Did you have a designated?
No, we also failed to designate. So far we're all flunking. I would say that we also got caught up a little on trying to understand how Johanna had the attitudes that she had, what influenced her. My question really is, how much freedom did these guards have in leaving the camps once they realized what was being asked of them? Were they forced to stay, and were they forced to complete the tasks assigned to them? I don't have the answer to that. Do you, Kael?
The only time they addressed that in the book is when they said she was allowed to leave because she got pregnant and was going to have a child, and that was her way out. That was one of the guards' ways out. Because that was very important to the Germans to have more babies. So,
right. But because we know that the German soldiers were not obligated to actually shoot the Jews if they didn't, feel they could, one wonders about the guards, how obligated they were to stay. And if they weren't, if there wasn't some great punishment for leaving, then I have no compassion for her whatsoever. Personally, I think if she had a choice to leave, that's what she should have done.
One of the things I think I neglected to say in telling her story was how much stability, financial stability, and educational stability for her son this job gave her.
That's very important.
Yeah.
Is there any information in the book as far as what happened to him, what he did, who raised him since she was in hiding?
I am inferring because she lived with her sister when she worked for a BMW plant that last year during the war. My guess is that maybe her son stayed with her sister, but I do not know that for sure. But obviously, group 2 brought up a really good point that more information is needed. Anyone else from group 2 have a thought?
As far as I know, these guards, once they were there, they could not leave. But I'm not sure where I read it, and I'm not sure how much veracity there is to that. But that was my understanding, that they were forced to stay, and it was not their decision whether they're going to shoot somebody or not. If they were told to kill, they killed.
And that was my impression too, Agnes. And from that first quote by Greta Buber-Newman, who said that they were too afraid to even ask to leave.
Yeah.
And so once they decided to stay, they just transformed into people that were barely recognizable from the girls who came in. All right, let's move on to group 3. Room 3, you were discussing how is it possible to hate one group of people but show compassion to another? And the loaded question, does this remind you of anyone you know? No names need to be mentioned. Group 3.
I was the political, I was the spokesperson that was voluntold that I would be speaking for the group.
Way to go, Group 3.
And we talked about a lot of things, but we talked about that sometimes that people compartmentalize things, and they come up with the attitude that we have to be better than others in order to rationalize their actions, what they are doing. One of my thoughts was that if she was such a fan of Hitler, that maybe that's where her hatred of the Jews came from, but yet we know she was showing compassion to Poles, and we wondered if maybe she was part Polish herself, if there was any Polish in her heritage.
That I do not know, but also more information that would be very valuable.
And that might be a reason for her her compassion. But and but we also had a member that said that found it hard to follow that if if you're compassionate to one group, then you should be compassionate to all people.
And that's hard to follow, or that's kind of a given that if you can be compassionate to one, you should be compassionate to another.
Right, that's kind of a given. So and if anybody from our group is wanting to chime in, I would greatly appreciate it here. But we talked about some of the political figures of the day. Since we're not mentioning names, that kind of reminded us of Johanna.
Anyone else from room 3 want to chime in?
The Hungarian Nazi Party didn't care that the Jews were also Hungarian too. And they were probably even more anxious to kill the Jews than the Germans were. So this relationship, because of your nationality, in my mind, does not exist. But that's just my experience.
Well, experience speaks very loudly.
Towards the end of the war, when the Germans knew that they were losing, the Hungarian Nazi Party was adamant to kill as many as possible. And they shot them into the Danube because they weren't dying fast enough in the ghetto. So there was no compassion because they were Hungarians.
One of the questions that we brought up ourselves was, how can you do this when obviously it has to conflict with your religious beliefs? And if she was such a strong Lutheran.
Yeah, and in the book, it talks more about that and how this was kind of a constant mental battle, especially after she came back from Auschwitz and could no longer deny what was really happening, and how it kind of caused a neurotic break in her brain.
Well, and I can see why.
And I think one other thing we did talk about is the more one takes an extremist position on just about anything, the more you begin dividing yourself from those who don't agree with that position or that set of beliefs, and anything that's different from you becomes evil.
Yeah.
That's so sad.
Certainly not ideal.
No. And not necessarily humane. But we'll get to that soon. Let's move to breakout room 4. If you were Johanna, what, if anything, would you have done differently and why? That is a really hard question because because you're not Johanna, but when we asked students to try to empathize, we say, put yourself in their shoes and just think about it. So, Darlene, are you speaking for room 4?
I am. Actually, we discussed it and we really didn't come up with anything she could have done differently based on her upbringing, her geographical location where she came from, and the climate of the day, and her religion and all the other stuff, and her son. We think that she was probably motivated to get involved to benefit her son. And once she got into that position, she couldn't get out of it without jeopardizing his future. And I think I think we came up with that being the motivator for why she didn't speak up more. I think if she would have put herself in a position of danger, it would have endangered him. So I think that's what we sort of concluded. We talked about everything that everybody else has mentioned, but we didn't come up with what she could have done safely based on her background and her motivation.
Darlene, I think Megan made a really good point, and she typed the chat in towards the end, and it really made an impact on me, because once she was in those camps, what Megan described was she had a choiceless choice.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I thought that was really impactful. She wasn't in a position to make any choices at that point in time.
Yeah, exactly.
I thought that was really, really
Good way
significant.
to put it. Yeah, I didn't quite pick that up.
Mm-hmm.
So we didn't solve the problem or answer the question. We just sort of discussed that she was in a terrible position. I said, you know, it's almost as if she was a feminist, but with a different motivation, a different bent.
Did she pass her prejudice onto her son, or did she teach him to look beyond people's looks and religion?
And this is what we don't know. We know very little about her from her own words. Most of what we know about her is from Greta Buber-Newman, who worked very closely with her in the camps, and then the historical research that Sarah Helm did. There is a film coming, but I think everything's on hold because of COVID. But there is a film about her coming out, hopefully sometime in the future.
Kael, we wondered if her son was involved in the Hitler Youth movement.
Oh.
You know, was that probably wasn't in the book, I guess.
It was not. If I had to make a guess, I would guess yes. Because if you were part of the Hitler, or if you were part of the Nazi party, it was almost required. One of the things about Ravensbrück that I didn't mention is it's on this beautiful idyllic lake, and the surrounding mountains and lake. It was really beautiful area until it became a concentration camp. There were 70 subcamps to Ravensbrück around that. But thank you. Anyone else from group 4 want to chime in before we move on? Because that's a really nice segue into this choiceless choice. I'm just going to share my screen one more time. Not that. That's not what I want to do. Where can I not? There we go. We're going to do some questions for contemplation. And because we have 90 minutes instead of 60, we're going to have a little bit of time to have a group conversation about this. We won't go back into breakout rooms. And I'll put these in the chat too. And these are not the only questions we need to contemplate or discuss, but this idea, and I know it's difficult when we know as little as we do about this person, but does she deserve my compassion or my condemnation? Or both? Can I relate to her in any way, and how? Do I know someone who reminds me of her, and what do I think about this person? And can examining her life and choices changed the way I examine my own. So I am going to put these in the chat so that we remember what they are if we want to address them. Let's see if sorry. There we go. Got them in there. Those 4 questions. Because I realized that I feel like I took a bit of a risk choosing Johanna Langefeld as the character to focus on for a book discussion. Partly, I did so because I could not choose of the victim stories in the book one, because they are all stories that are worth telling and need to be told. So I realized that taking this route it could be a little bit controversial, because this is hard, talking about the life of a perpetrator and asking if she deserves compassion is a hard thing to wrap one's mind around. But in this time of polarization in our own country, where we see on social media, we are dug in our country of we are with one group or we are with the other group. And as many of you know, IHE is always talking about seeking the humanity in others, searching for that humanity, trying to identify with those who are really different from us. And so I know I'm asking a lot today to ask you to identify with this woman who was part of such a heinous time in history and allowed such awful things to happen.
Well, I have something to say. I think that, as far as I'm concerned, from what you had said, because I didn't read the book and I didn't read anything before this, I think that she might deserve compassion because she didn't know that her husband was going to die 2 years after she got married and she had a baby. So maybe that could be why she decided to go the route. And you said that she took this job because she needed to support and take care of her son. I mean, obviously she was living with her sister, so she didn't have enough money to live by herself or whatever. I don't really know, but I think that the situation that happened to her possibly played into the decisions that she made.
And sometimes that's good to know the whys, to come up with some reasons that explain things, but does that excuse the decisions that are made if they end up hurting people?
I'll chime in. This is Megan Helberg in Burwell. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a teacher here. I'm on my lunch break. So
Thank you.
Thankful for this time slot. But anyway, something that kept coming to my mind was actually something that we talked a lot about when I was able to go on a trip to Rwanda and study that genocide a bit more. But something that kept coming up over and over in conversation with our group was, you know, do you want to be remembered by your worst act or your best act? And does one outweigh the other? Does it matter what the bad act is? You know, is there a certain point where you go, oh, okay, well, we'll let it go. But once you get here, nope, we're not going to let that go anymore. And so I think that's something, obviously I realize this is an incredibly serious situation, but I think personally, I don't want to be judged on the worst thing that I've ever done in my life, because I feel like I've also done a lot of really great things to help my community and family and, you know, students and things like that. But also I still feel like, you know, it's very conflicting because I feel like there needs to be some sort of punishment, but also I'm not ready to cast her off and just condemn her for the rest of her life either. But that's just me personally. So, and it's taken a lot of work for me even to get to a point of that, because I used to be quite, you know, if someone has done something wrong, then they need to be punished, and this is how it needs to work. But even in the last 4 or 5 years of my own life, I have maybe shifted my mindset a little bit. So
Thanks, Megan. I'm so glad you came again.
thanks for having me.
Yeah, you know, Kael, from the little bit that we know about Johanna and thinking about her maternal instincts and her rationale for getting started in this, I wonder if two things, if she really knew what she was getting into. And I doubt it. I doubt that she really knew what was coming and what she was getting into. And then by that time, I think it was too late. And the other thing is, she obviously, at the end, expected punishment and thought she deserved punishment for what she had done, participated in. So I think that's kind of telling. There was an interesting, I don't know if anybody's read, I read a lot of historical fiction. It lets somebody else do the research for me. So when you read The Lilac Girls, it's about the bunnies from Ravensbrück, which was the first time I'd heard about this. And there's talk in there about, and this is accurate, about a female doctor who participated in the experiments. And she actually was tried at Nuremberg. And then she was incarcerated and got her sentence commuted. I don't think she served more than not even 18 months. So it was just sort of weird to learn that. So
And then went back to practice for many years until she was discovered.
Yeah, that just was crazy. So it was like she didn't think she should have been punished, but obviously she deserved it and then got off with it. So it's hard to reconcile that. And I think what that physician did was much more deliberate than what Johanna did as far as her actions.
I would love to ask Johanna when she said she needed to go to jail at least for 2 years.
Right.
I would have liked to say, why just 2?
Yeah.
But don't you think that, we can't really look at the punishments that were meted out because there was no justice done whatsoever.
Right.
And I agree with you, Megan, about we shouldn't necessarily be judged by our worst acts, but certain acts are unforgivable.
Absolutely.
And I do think that being a guard in a concentration camp is an unforgivable act because they brought about, the murder of so many people. And whether they intended it or not, when they went, as guards, I don't think it matters. Now, again, I ask, could they have left? Because to me, that's a very important question. And what might have been the punishment if they refused to act in certain ways? I don't know. That also would be important. But I can't see it as forgivable. And I hesitate to try to create compassion for perpetrators.
Exactly.
I know we want to look at everybody and understand them, but maybe there's a line that we can't cross as far as being compassionate and understanding.
I think Gloria brings up several really good points. Where is that line? Why do we want to understand these people? And what compels us to even want to show them compassion? Scott raised his hand.
You just said something interesting. Why do we want to understand? I think we want to understand because we can't understand, meaning that that what they did is so contrary to how we see each other as humans. And so I think that's one of the reasons that we want to understand, and actually we'll never get an answer that will truly give us understanding.
Right. one of the things that has come up a lot in the discussion is this need to know more knowledge. Like, could she have left? And you know, what was she really able to do? And so one of the things we haven't talked about is power dynamics, and who had power and privilege and how much in these situations. I thought maybe it might come up when we were talking about how is she similar to the inmates and how is she different? And I think Darlene brought up a similarity is that she was very stuck. She was very stuck at Ravensbrück, and perhaps only saw just, you know, I just got to do this, and all I can do is press forward. And how is she different? My answer would have been power and privilege, to be sure. She had much more power than the inmates, but that's something that I find that in question number 4, can examining her life and choices change the way I examine my own? And everybody said, you know, well, I think it was Darlene again, who said, did she know what she was getting into? And I think probably not. So any thoughts on number 4, can examining her choices change the way I examine my own?
Absolutely. I would say, you know, it makes me even more committed to trying to do what's best for the majority of humankind, and to stop being twisted and manipulated by governments and authorities that are hateful, divisive, and not really looking for the best interest of all human beings. So I think for me, it's good to reflect on these kinds of things so that I can be even more committed to what I know I have to do for the greater good.
I think right now a lot of people, or at least what I hear sometimes in modern day society, of people making choices, and we were talking about, you know, this woman as well. Well, it was financially stable for her. It was secure. It helped her, you know, have money for her son and her. Well, when do your moral choices outweigh finances? And I think we see that a lot in today's society of, oh yeah, well, I'm afraid to do this or that because, well, I'm getting a steady paycheck, or, you know, whatever. But when are your morals going to rise above money? So that makes me think my own everyday actions as well, I guess.
God bless democracy. And let us work for that, to keep it up, because to live in tyranny is a horrible, horrible thing.
I agree. And having safety, like those of us who went through education college know Maslow's hierarchy, you know, where at the very bottom, if you don't have safety and security, if you don't have enough food, if you don't know where you're sleeping tonight, if you don't know how you're going to pay for your kids' shoes tomorrow, all of these theoretical ideas become moot, because all your brain energy is taken up with how am I just going to make it through tomorrow. And the thing I walked away with from this book is that this horrible, corrupt, violent Nazi regime punished everyone. The Germans, who thought they were good people, the Jews, who were the object of their disdain and violence, everyone, except a very few elite people who were able to live lives of luxury. It was damaging to everyone. So with that, I'm going to share my screen again. We're going to wrap up because some of you have book club to go to, and that may even need a bathroom break before, but those of you who are familiar with Holocaust education in the ADL have probably seen this pyramid of hate before. It has become part of almost my weekly conversations. And this word at the top, othering, I hope you can see that definition. To view or treat a person or a group of people intrinsically different from an alien to oneself. And this is a word you may have heard in the news, this othering, where we group ourselves into groups, and my group is right and that group is wrong.
Right.
And then we start off at the bottom just with these stereotyping and insensitive remarks and derogatory, they're stupid, they're ignorant, you know, they don't deserve this, that, or the other. And then of course, what happens in our brains comes out into our actions. And then of course, we know in the Holocaust how these things evolved and escalated and no one interrupted them. And so this is always the hard part when you try to take Holocaust education for children and make it pertinent into their lives, because sometimes it feels like it greatly diminishes the gravity of this situation. But of course, this is what we want to do. We want to take what we know happened and we want it to change the way we live our lives today. And so upon leaving, I would just ask you to maybe notice where we see some of these things happening today with, because it's very easy to see it when it comes from people who do not think like you, right? I can point that out so easily. Look what they did. Look what they did. It is a little bit harder for me to identify that standing inside of my own group. But I am trying. That is my goal for 2021. And then to ask myself in my position of power and privilege, what I can do to interrupt the escalation of othering, because there are two men that I've quoted here at the end that I greatly admire. And the first one, of course, is Elie Wiesel. And there's a very famous quote that we must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. We must always take sides. And also be careful that we do not become the hate that we are fighting against. And so my last quote is by an author I've become very familiar with over the last 5 years, Richard Rohr, who says that we can all become well-disguised mirror images of anything that we fight too long or too directly. That which we oppose determines the energy and frames the questions after a while. And most frontal attacks on evil just produce another kind of evil in ourselves. And so with that, I will leave you with that call to action and that request. Just a reminder that we do have 2 books here. If you would like to borrow one, just let us know. I even deliver because it gives me an opportunity to actually see people, if even through the screen door. And I just wanted to mention that next month, we're having a guest from SUNY Empire State College in New York. Her name is Dr. Eileen Angelini, and she'll be talking about the Veldiv Roundup, the largest mass arrest in French history. She's a Fulbright specialist, a documentary maker, a Holocaust educator, but she is really also a thoroughly engaging presenter. So next month, third Thursdays, January 21st at 11:30. I hope you will join us then. Thank you
Watch
so
for
much.
an email that will be sent with more information.
Absolutely.
Thank you. This was